We tend to think about cemeteries as places for the dead, but in ancient Egypt, cemeteries were much more than that. This is one of the things that fascinated me more about ancient Egyptian culture, and it is that they are putting all this effort into their tombs instead of their houses, for example, or their palaces or their government buildings. And this is because a lot of the society, a lot of the negotiation of identity, status would happen in the cemetery. My name is Sergio Alarcón Robledo, and I am doing research on Egyptian archaeology at Harvard University. My research looks at architectural change through the census. I started working in Egypt back in 2011, first as an architect, drawing plans and taking care of fragile structures. But I realized quite early that I wanted to know more about the structures and the context in which they were built. So in my dissertation, I'm trying to understand the factors that led architectural design. So what did ancient builders have in mind when they were shaping these buildings? And in order to do that, I wanted to remove myself from the paradigms of modern architecture. I thought that looking into visual and acoustic perceptions of the spaces could help me remove myself from my own assumptions and get closer to how ancient people could have perceived the space. The site of North Saqqara, which is the case study that I used for my PhD, was excavated in the beginning of the 20th century and only very fragmentarily published. So the first step of my research was going back to those documents, looking at these photographs and plans and notes of the excavators. But the general plan of the necropolis is lost, or it never existed, we don't know. So the first step was reconstructing the layout of the cemetery. In order to do this, I have been using a technique called photogrammetry, which entails taking lots of photographs with the appropriate overlap. Normally, you would do this with drones, but for security reasons, it's not easy to get permissions in Egypt to use drones. So what I did is I put a camera on top of a 7.5 meter pole, and I used a remote shooter to systematically take photographs of the landscape. And this helps you transform these photographs into a three-dimensional model of the landscape. I have then used this 3D model to look for traces of the shapes of the structures on the ground. But this is just the beginning. After reconstructing the layout, I'm using other techniques to make analysis of the census. So I'm using various softwares to reconstruct three-dimensional models of the structures. We are even using, for example, virtual reality, not only as an outreach tool, but also as a research tool, because through virtual reality models, we can really try to simulate some of the perceptions which we could achieve in those spaces that we cannot access. So when we started looking into the acoustics of the tombs, we didn't know if the ancient Egyptians thought about the acoustic properties of the spaces, so we didn't know what we would find out. And finding that some of the shapes and sizes actually do match with very relevant aspects of human experience is very exciting, because in a way it connects you with ancient Egyptian people. So for example, we have found that the features of the facade of some of the tombs have a shape and a size that specifically resonates with sound within the frequency range of human voice. In other words, these features would help keep voice private in a way. And it's very interesting because we know that these are places where ancient Egyptian people would make offerings to the deceased and would presumably communicate with the deceased. Of course, one thing is finding how the structures shape sound. A different thing is finding out whether the ancient Egyptians were aware of this. And one more step would be knowing that they manipulated architecture for this. So this is just the beginning of the process, and it's hard to tell how far we will get, but I believe that by asking these questions, we are already pushing the field forward as we are looking at the structures in a different way.